It was 3 p.m. on Monday, February 21st, 1977, and Teresita Basa was feeling happy that her shift at North Chicago's Edgewater Hospital was over. She smiled and said goodbye to a couple of her coworkers as she closed her locker and shrugged into her winter coat. It was winter in Chicago, which meant the days were very cold and very short. That day, the sunset was barely after 5 p.m. But with her shift ending at 3 p.m., she'd be home by 4 p.m., which meant she'd still have a full hour of daylight before darkness fell over her adopted city. Already looking forward to that magical hour inside of her cozy 4-bedroom apartment, the slender 47-year-old woman from the Philippines made her way out onto the street and walked to the nearby elevated train station. A few minutes later, a train arrived and Teresita climbed on board. It wasn't rush hour, so there were plenty of seats to choose from. She found one she liked and she sat down right as the train began pulling out of the station. After putting her bag on the seat next to her, she turned around in her seat and put her fingertips against the window behind her. And even through her glove, she could feel how cold the glass was. Despite having lived in the United States for almost 15 years, there were times, especially in the winter, when she still felt surprised by how completely different Chicago was when compared to her hometown of Dumaguete, a city located 8,000 miles away on Negros Island in the southern Philippines. Here in Chicago, Teresita was surrounded by towering skyscrapers, and the average temperature in February hovered right around freezing. Back in Dumaguete, nicknamed the City of Gentle People, the temperature in February was hot, and the landscape was green and lush with lots of graceful Spanish-style architecture. But much as Teresita sometimes missed the Philippines and her family who still lived there, she was sure that if she had not come to the US, she never would have had a chance to achieve her dream. A dream that right now, Teresita felt was almost within her grasp. Much as she liked it, her current job as a respiratory therapist at the hospital was really just a means to an end, a way to pay her rent and to afford her beautiful piano that waited for her in her living room at home. She liked working with the patients, diagnosing and analyzing lung function, and then helping the doctors create treatment plans and prescribe interventions and medications. But this job was not why Teresita had left her home in the Philippines and come to America. She had come to America to pursue her lifelong passion, music. As a young child, Teresita begged her parents for piano lessons, and when they relented and let her have piano lessons, she was over the moon and played piano basically all the time. And when she wasn't playing the piano, she was marching around her home, humming along to the notes of the music in her head. Once Teresita had finished high school, she had been among the very small percent of women in her town at that time, it was the late 1940s, early 1950s, to go on to university in the Philippines' capital city of Manila. And after graduating from there, Teresita became part of an even smaller percentage of women who went on to get their master's degree. This time, Teresita would leave the Philippines to attend Indiana University in the United States. By the time she was enrolled at Indiana University, Teresita had decided that she would become a music teacher, not a concert pianist, which had been her original intended career path in music. Although when she got to Chicago, she would become a member of a very serious musical band called the Five Mahoganies Plus One that performed for large paying crowds. After getting her master's degree in Indiana, Teresita had moved north to Chicago, where she got her job at the hospital, and she enrolled at Chicago's Loyola University to get her doctorate in music. Her hope was that afterward, she would be hired by Loyola University and would become a professor of music, thereby fulfilling her dream. As the train she was on rattled down the tracks, inside her gloved hand pressing against the window, Teresita could feel the beautiful pearl cocktail ring her mother had given her the last time she had come to visit in Chicago. The ring had been a gift to Teresita's mother from Teresita's father, a wealthy judge, who had bought the jewelry for his wife while visiting France. Before returning to Dumaguete after that last visit, Teresita's mother had pressed the ring, along with a heavy jade pendant and a few other pieces of jewelry, into her daughter's hands, telling Teresita to wear them, and when she did, to think of her parents and how much they loved her. Teresita was an only child, and she knew full well just how much her mother and father had hoped she would return to the Philippines. Teresita understood that this gift of jewelry was her mother's way of telling her that her parents had finally accepted Teresita's decision to stay in the United States. Even though her mother's eyes had been filled with tears when she gave the jewelry to her daughter, Teresita knew how proud her parents were of her accomplishments and her determination to be self-sufficient and independent. As the train finally came to a stop at the station located just 4 blocks from her apartment building, Teresita grabbed her bag and then pulled her coat tight around her. She stood up and then headed out the train doors into the cold. By the time she reached her apartment building, Teresita had already planned out how she would spend her evening. She would practice piano, and then she would spend some time on her doctoral thesis and on the book she was writing about music composition and theory. She was also hoping to call a few people who might be interested in buying tickets to the next performance of her band, the 5 Mahoganies Plus One, and maybe she'd give her cousin a call too. Her cousin had actually also immigrated to the Chicago area from the Philippines, and so the two often chatted on the phone, enjoying a rare chance to speak in their native tongue, Tagalog. After getting off the elevator on the 15th floor, Teresita turned and began walking down the hallway toward her apartment, which was number 15B. Once she reached her door, she unlocked it with her key, she stepped inside, and she closed the door behind her. She took off her winter coat and hung it neatly in her closet. Then she took off her mother's pearl ring and carefully placed it next to her mother's jade necklace, which was on top of the dresser in her bedroom. After freshening up in the bathroom, Teresita went into her living room and she sat down at her beloved piano. As she ran her fingers across the keys, she looked out the nearby window and was happy to still see sunlight. With a smile on her face, she turned back to her piano, she closed her eyes, and she began to play. A few hours later, at around 8 p.m. that evening, Teresita heard a quiet knock on her front door. She set aside the work she had been doing on her doctoral thesis and walked toward the front of her apartment. When she reached the door, she called out, "Who's there?" When she got the answer, Teresita smiled, undid the lock and deadbolt, and then invited her guest inside. 1 hour later, at 9 p.m., the first fire engine screeched to a halt in front of Teresita's apartment building. The crowd of residents and curious bystanders gathered in front of the building scattered as firefighters jumped down from the truck and headed inside up the stairs to the 15th floor. 20 minutes earlier, the building's janitor had called 911 to report that residents had smelled and seen smoke coming out from under the door of apartment 15B. And sure enough, when firefighters arrived on the 15th floor, they saw thick curls of smoke pouring out from under that apartment door into the hallway. The janitor ran up and used his key to unlock 15B's door before turning and running back down the hall to the stairwell. With the door unlocked, the firefighters made entry. Inside apartment 15B, firefighters quickly saw and extinguished the source of the fire. It was a burning mattress on the floor of the bedroom, and near it was a pile of burning clothes. Once a thorough search revealed that the apartment was empty of any people, a fire department lieutenant used his boot to kick aside the smoldering pile of clothes, trying to see what might have caused the fire. Crowding in behind the lieutenant were a couple of uniformed police officers who had also arrived at the scene. And when those police officers and the lieutenant saw what was under those smoldering clothes, they instantly stepped back and turned their faces aside. Then, one of the police officers grabbed his radio and called for medical personnel, homicide detectives, and a crime scene unit. The first thing Chicago detective Joe Stachula and his partner Lee Eppen noticed when they stepped inside of Teresita's apartment was the mess. Looking into the kitchen, they could see drawers had been pulled out and cupboards were open, and in the living room, lamps had been knocked over and a coffee table overturned. But even though they were preparing for something much worse when they stepped into Teresita's bedroom, what they actually saw still stunned them. In front of them, lying on her back on the floor next to the bed, was the body of a woman. The fire had burned most of the dark wavy hair from her head, along with most of the skin on the right side of her face. She was naked, her knees were spread wide apart, but her feet were almost touching each other. Her arms were out to either side, bent upwards at the elbows, so her hands were near her head. And in the very center of her chest was a large kitchen knife, buried into her torso right up to the wooden hilt. It did not take detectives long to confirm that the body in 15B was that of Teresita Basa. And based on the condition of her body and the disorder inside of her apartment, it also didn't take investigators long to come up with a working theory of what happened to her. Since the door to her apartment was not deadbolted from the inside, police assumed that Teresita had opened the door for her killer. and once the killer, who they believed was male, was inside, he overpowered Teresita, he sexually assaulted her, and then he murdered her. After she was dead, he ransacked her apartment looking for valuables, and then before leaving, he tried to burn her body to destroy any incriminating evidence. But when the autopsy report came back a few days later, this working theory fell apart. According to the medical examiner, not only was there no evidence of sexual assault, it turned out that Teresita was actually a virgin. So, with this new information, the police now knew that Teresita's body had been staged to look like a sexual assault had taken place. The killer, who they now knew could easily have been a man or a woman, likely was just trying to confuse police. As for the robbery angle, the police had no way of knowing if anything was actually taken from apartment 15B because Teresita lived there alone, and so only Teresita would have known if something was missing. And while the fire had been relatively small and mostly contained to just Teresita's bedroom, it had been big enough that it completely destroyed any evidence of fingerprints on the murder weapon. Additionally, interviews with Teresita's neighbors, co-workers, family, friends, university professors, supervisors, and possible love interests all led to one dead end after another. While Teresita occasionally entertained male visitors and went out on a few dates, there did not appear to be any serious boyfriends in her life. 10 years earlier, Teresita had fallen in love with a man from Chicago, but on a trip home to the Philippines to meet her family, the man had turned up drunk and naked in the city's red light district with a teenage girl on his lap. Ever since then, Teresita had become much more interested in friendship than in romance. As a result, there was no sign of some of the more obvious murder motives like jealousy, affairs, marital problems, or sexual entanglements. And when it came to identifying possible suspects at Edgewood Medical Center, the hospital itself was so big, with hundreds of employees working various schedules in dozens of different departments, and hundreds more visitors and visiting medical personnel, that detectives had to narrow their interviews to just co-workers whose shifts and responsibilities overlapped with Teresita's. And the verdict among that small group was unanimous. Everybody loved Teresita. She was kind, she was quiet but friendly, she was great with her patients, she was good at her job, she was reliable, punctual, hardworking, and at lunch in the cafeteria, she liked to eat alone, always sitting in the same place, humming bars of music in between bites of her food. Teresita's neighbors on the 15th floor of her apartment building didn't have anything to add either. They said Teresita did periodically have guests at her apartment, but on the night of her murder, no one on the floor had seen anyone enter or leave Teresita's apartment. By the end of April, 6 weeks after Teresita's murder, detectives Stachula and Eppin had gotten virtually nowhere on the case. However, they did have two viable leads. The first lead had to do with a phone call Teresita received on the night of her murder. Teresita's friend, Ruth Loeb, called her around 7:30 p.m., and the two women chatted for about 20 minutes. Ruth would tell the detectives that on this call, Teresita mentioned that she was going to have a visitor over that night, and Ruth would recall actually hearing a man's voice in the background of Teresita's apartment toward the end of their phone call. However, Teresita didn't say who this male visitor was, and Ruth didn't recognize the voice. 1 hour after Ruth and Teresita hung up their phones, authorities would discover Teresita's body. This meant Teresita had been killed right after her call with Ruth. This also meant that Teresita's unknown male visitor that night had most likely been her killer. The second lead detectives had was a cryptic note that Teresita had written in her personal diary. It just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." But to that point, police had not come across anyone or heard of any friend or acquaintance of Teresita's with the initials A.S., so they had no idea who this A.S. person was. But despite these promising leads, detectives continued to hit dead end after dead end in their investigation. And so by the summer of 1977, Teresita's murder seemed destined to go unsolved. However, that would not be the case, because something incredibly unusual and downright disturbing was about to happen that would lead the detectives to the killer. Not long after Teresita's murder, one of the other respiratory therapists at Edgewater Hospital began to act very strangely. Her name was Remy Chua, she was 38 years old, and like Teresita, she was from the Philippines. Remy didn't work the same shift as Teresita, and so she had very little interaction with her and didn't know her well. But, according to Remy's co-workers, following Teresita's death, Remy began using Teresita's locker at work, and she also began to sit in the exact same seat in the cafeteria that Teresita would always sit at. Remy even began to hum as she sat there alone and ate her lunch, just like Teresita had. Remy also began to talk at length about a brand new interest she had, music. Unsettled by what they considered to be Remy's obvious impersonation of a murdered colleague, Remy's co-workers eventually asked her why she was doing what she was doing. But Remy just looked at them confused and then waved them off dismissively and said she was not acting like Teresita, she was acting like herself. Eventually, when Remy's behavior didn't stop, a few of her co-workers complained to their supervisor. And when the supervisor approached Remy and told her about her co-workers' complaints, Remy became furious and aggressive. And in fact, her outburst got so out of hand that the supervisor wound up firing her. When Remy arrived home that day, she was still very upset. Her husband, Dr. Jose Chua, who was a surgeon in Chicago, not at Edgewater but at another hospital, instantly noticed that his wife looked distraught, so he asked her to come sit down with him and tell him what was wrong. So Remy walked into the living room, she sat down in a chair, and then she began to tell her husband a sort of distorted version of what had happened. She told her husband not that she was just fired, but rather that her job had just been canceled, and so now she was out of work. Remy didn't mention anything about her mimicry of Teresita Basa and how that had actually led to her job loss. Now, at this point in the story, you need to understand that Dr. Chua had no idea that there were any strange things happening with his wife. She seemed totally normal to him up until she had come home upset. Also, at this point, Dr. Chua had never heard the name Teresita Basa before. He had no idea who she was, or that she had worked with his wife at the hospital, or that she had recently been killed. So, when Dr. Chua's wife suddenly stood up from her chair in the living room mid-sentence and just said kind of robotically that she was going to go lie down for a while, Dr. Chua had no idea that he and his wife were about to get drawn into one of the most bizarre and unlikely murder investigations in American history. After Remy stood up and left for her bedroom, her mother, who was visiting the couple, would say that the look on her daughter's face was so strange that she turned and asked Dr. Chua to follow her and make sure his wife was okay. Dr. Chua did just that, and he arrived in the bedroom to find his wife lying on top of the bed, staring blankly up at the ceiling. Startled by the fixed look on his wife's face, Dr. Chua sat down next to her on the edge of the bed and asked her, "Is anything wrong?" But the voice that answered him did not belong to his wife. It was instead a voice he had never heard before. It spoke in the native Philippine language of Tagalog, which he and his wife both knew but rarely used, and the voice spoke with a distinct Spanish accent that he had never heard his wife use before. "Doctor," the voice coming out of his wife's mouth said, "you must help me." Dr. Chua was so caught off guard by this alien-sounding voice that he immediately defaulted to his medical training. He decided he needed to check to see if his wife was actually coherent or not, so he asked her a simple question: "What is your name?" But instead of his wife saying Remy in her normal voice, she said, still speaking in Tagalog with a Spanish accent, "I am Teresita Basa." Dr. Chua felt chills go all over his body. Then, after a pause, he said that he didn't know anyone by that name. When his wife just lay there motionless, still staring up at the ceiling, Dr. Chua broke the silence and said, "Well, what do you want?" The voice responded immediately. She said she had been murdered and she wanted to tell the doctor the name of her killer. Dr. Chua was at a complete loss. Nothing in his medical training had prepared him for what he was experiencing. And so he just started stroking his wife's arm and telling her that everything was okay and to relax and that she needed to wake up now and come back to him. But as he tried to kind of calm his wife down, the voice coming out of her mouth only became more insistent. It told Dr. Chua the first and last name of her killer. Then the voice gave very specific details of her own murder. The voice said that her killer had arrived alone at her apartment around 8 p.m. on the night of Monday, February 21st, and that she, Teresita, had let him in because he was a friend. But this friend, once inside of her apartment, had stabbed Teresita and killed her. In all, Remy's apparent trance lasted for about 30 minutes. When she came to, she began glancing around the room wildly when she saw her husband sitting on the bed next to her looking gravely concerned, and her mother standing in the corner looking horrified. Remy asked, "What's going on?" Dr. Chua gently asked his wife if she remembered anything that had just happened. Puzzled, Remy shook her head no and said that the last thing she remembered was sitting in the chair in the living room, and that she had no idea how she got to this bedroom. Dr. Chua, who was very rattled by what he had just experienced, took a deep breath and then tried to explain to his wife everything that had just happened in that bedroom. When Dr. Chua asked Remy if she knew this woman, Teresita Basa, Remy, who was now visibly shaking, told her husband that she did. Teresita was a woman she worked with at the hospital and that she had just been killed. But Remy said she barely knew her, they were just acquaintances. However, as she told her husband this, Remy suddenly remembered something that happened to her 2 weeks earlier that she had tried to forget about, but now she couldn't help but bring it up. Remy said 2 weeks earlier, she had gone into the break room at the hospital after a long shift to take a nap, and just seconds after closing her eyes, she felt a presence in the room with her. Thinking one of her coworkers must have silently stepped into the room, she was horrified when she opened her eyes, and there, standing right in front of her, staring down at her, was the recently murdered Teresita Basa. Remy was so instantly terrified that without making a sound, she just leapt to her feet and ran out of the room and down the hallway. After a few seconds, she stopped running and she turned around, but Teresita wasn't there anymore. With her heart still pounding, Remy told herself that she must have just imagined seeing Teresita, that was all just a dream. But she couldn't shake the image of Teresita standing there staring at her. It felt so real. Terrified and embarrassed, she had decided not to tell anyone about seeing the ghost of Teresita until now. After hearing the story, Dr. Chua told his wife that, of course, that must have just been a dream. Don't worry about that. I'm sure that's nothing. But deep down, he was frightened too, and couldn't understand how that could have happened just 2 weeks ago, and now they're in this bedroom dealing with this trance scenario that involves Teresita. Shifting the conversation back to reality, Dr. Chua asked his wife if she recognized the name of Teresita's killer. The voice had repeated the name several times, and Remy would say yes, she did know who that person was. But ultimately, the Chuas decided that they could not possibly go to the police with any of this information. How could they explain to police how they got it? They'd look foolish or crazy or even suspicious. So the couple just kind of went on with their day and acted like Remy's trance had never happened. Then, that night, Remy got a telephone call. Dr. Chua, who was standing nearby when his wife answered, could hear a man's voice on the other end of the line. His wife only managed to say a few words before hanging up the receiver, but when she turned back to her husband, her face was pale. She told him that it was someone from work whose voice she didn't recognize, but the man had just threatened her and told her that he was, quote, going to get her next. Again, out of fear, the Chuas decided not to go to police. 2 days later, while Remy was on the phone talking to a real estate agent standing near where her husband was sitting, Remy suddenly dropped the telephone receiver and stood awkwardly still and went into another trance. Again, the voice that came out of Remy's mouth was not her own. It was the voice that claimed to be Teresita. And this time, the voice was even more insistent. "You must help me, doctor," she pleaded. "You are the only one who can help find my killer. You must go to the police with everything I've told you." The voice went on to tell Dr. Chua not to be afraid, that he would not get in trouble for coming forward with this information, that Teresita would protect him and his family. However, once Remy snapped out of this second trance, the Chuas again did not go to the police. Even though they were starting to believe that these trances might actually be real, that Teresita really was communicating with them from beyond the grave, they felt like they didn't have any real evidence to back up what this voice was claiming, and so they still just could not go to police. No one would believe them. A few days later, Remy would fall into yet another trance. While Remy and her husband were asleep in bed, Remy suddenly opened her eyes and, while remaining stiff as a board on her back, she began speaking to Dr. Chua in the now familiar Tagalog with the Spanish inflection. When Dr. Chua woke up and saw what was happening right next to him, he was ready. He demanded that the voice provide real proof that could confirm her claim about the killer's identity, and the voice would do just that. According to the voice, after Teresita had let her killer inside of her apartment, the killer had knocked her unconscious, and after stabbing her, he had rifled through her apartment and taken several pieces of jewelry that had been given to her by her mother. Her killer had disposed of some of the pieces, but he had kept a jade and gold necklace and a pearl cocktail ring that he had given to his longtime girlfriend with whom he lived. Not only did the voice describe every detail of the ring and the necklace, but also the voice told Dr. Chua the names and the phone numbers of Teresita's relatives who lived in the Chicago area who could actually identify this jewelry as belonging to Teresita. The voice ended the trance by telling Dr. Chua that once police found this jewelry, they would find the killer. After this third visitation from what appeared to be the spirit of Teresita, Dr. Chua and Remy felt like they had to share this information with authorities. But the Chuas were still nervous about going public with their story, so instead of contacting the Chicago police, they contacted their own local police department in Evanston, Illinois, which was north of Chicago. And instead of saying that they had got all this information from the voice of a dead woman, they told the police that Remy had received that threatening phone call from a former co-worker at Edgewater Hospital, and they identified this co-worker using the name of the man that the voice, Teresita, had said was her murderer. The Chuas then surprised the Evanston police by suggesting that this threatening phone call could be related to the murder of Teresita Basa. It should be noted that we don't know if Remy and Dr. Chua concocted this story in order to more discreetly tell police what they had learned from the voice, or if they actually came to believe that the person who called Remy and threatened her was the same person who the voice identified as the killer. So, in early August 1977, 5 months after Teresita's death, Chicago detective Joe Stachula was notified by Evanston police about a possible tip in the Teresita murder case. A few days later, when Detective Stachula followed up directly with the Evanston police for more details on this tip, the Evanston police officer told Stachula the name the Chuas had given them of the man who had apparently made this harassing phone call and who the Chuas thought was connected to the murder of Teresita Basa. And when Detective Stachula heard this person's name, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up straight. A few days after that, Detective Stachula found himself sitting in the Chua's living room, staring at a highly educated and articulate couple who seemed incredibly reluctant to elaborate in any way on the tip they had called in to the Evanston police station. After a brief description from Remy about the threatening call she had received almost 3 weeks earlier, Detective Stachula could no longer ignore Dr. Chua's obvious distress as the doctor sat there shifting in his seat and wringing his hands while his wife was speaking. When Detective Stachula turned towards the doctor and asked him point blank, "Is there something about this murder investigation that you want to tell me?" Dr. Chua looked extremely embarrassed, but instead of answering the detective's question, the surgeon leaned forward and looked intently at the detective's face before asking a question of his own. "Do you believe in the occult or in possession and exorcism?" Detective Stachula worded his answer carefully, telling Dr. Chua that as a homicide investigator, he always tried to keep an open mind and follow up on any information that could help solve a murder case. Dr. Chua nodded silently, then took a deep breath, and he told the detective the whole story of how, starting back in mid-July, the spirit of Teresita Basa had begun temporarily possessing his wife's body. And during these possessions, Teresita would give them very specific information, like about the exact type of jewelry that was taken from her apartment, that Teresita insisted would help police catch her killer, a man named Alan Showery. When Detective Stachula had first heard the Evanston police officer say this name, Alan Showery, it had caused the hairs on his neck to stand up because Alan's initials were A.S., just like the initials written in that cryptic note Teresita had left in her personal diary before she was killed. The note had just said, "Buy tickets for A.S." When Detective Stachula asked the couple if they knew anything about this Alan Showery person, Remy said Alan was a 31-year-old respiratory technician at Edgewater Hospital and he was friends with Teresita. However, it would turn out he was one of the employees at the hospital who was not originally interviewed by police because his shifts did not overlap with Teresita's. While the information that Dr. Chua and Remy had just told him sounded very promising, the fact that it was apparently delivered by the murder victim herself after she was dead seemed so unbelievable to Detective Stachula that instead of writing up a formal police report about his interview with the Chuas, he instead just described the interview in a confidential memo that he sent only to his commanding officer. Following the Chua interview, police would rule out Remy and her husband, Dr. Chua, as suspects in Teresita's murder because both of them had rock-solid alibis. The police would also run a background check on Alan Showery, and it would show that he had a lengthy rap sheet, which included being arrested for, but not convicted of, theft, burglary, and rape. Through new interviews with Teresita's co-workers, police confirmed that Alan and Teresita were friends and that on the night of her murder, Alan may have gone to Teresita's apartment to fix her broken TV set, because apparently someone had overheard him say that. And if that was true, that would place him right at the scene of the crime. So, on the afternoon of August 11th, 1977, almost 6 months after Teresita was killed, Detectives Stachula and Eppin arrived at the apartment of Alan and his girlfriend Yanka and asked to speak with Alan down at the police station about Teresita's murder. While Alan immediately agreed to the request and chatted to detectives on the ride to the station about what a wonderful person and good friend Teresita had been, he also insisted to police that the last time he had seen Teresita was 6 months before her death. But when investigators bluffed, telling him they'd found his fingerprints at Teresita's apartment, Alan reconsidered, saying that on second thought, he had been at Teresita's apartment on the night of her murder to fix her TV, but that he had left at 6:30 p.m. because he didn't have the right tools with him to fix the TV. At that point, police went back to Alan's apartment to see if Yanka could confirm her husband's alibi. But it wasn't what Yanka had to say that grabbed officers' attention. It was what she was wearing. There, on one of her fingers, officers saw a large, distinctive pearl cocktail ring. It was exactly like the one that the Chuas said belonged to Teresita and had been taken from her apartment by the killer. When investigators asked Yanka where she had gotten the ring, she told them it was a late Christmas present, along with some other pieces of jewelry that Alan had given her in late February, which would have been right around the time that Teresita was murdered. Detectives immediately asked Yanka to join her husband at the police station and to bring her jewelry collection with her. Yanka agreed, and then police, using the list of names and phone numbers that Dr. Chua had given them, contacted some of Teresita's relatives who lived in the area, and they came to the police station as well. And those relatives, including Teresita's cousin, immediately identified the ring Yanka was wearing and the jade pendant in her jewelry box as the jewelry that Teresita's father had bought in France for Teresita's mother, and that Teresita's mother had then given the jewelry to Teresita during her last visit to Chicago. When police confronted Alan with the ring, along with the information provided by Teresita's relatives, Alan abandoned his claim that he was innocent of any involvement in Teresita's murder, and by early the next morning, on August 12, 1977, police had a 13-page signed confession from Alan. According to that confession and additional interviews from Teresita's co-workers, this is what happened to Teresita on the night of her murder. Alan arrived at Teresita's apartment at about 6:30 p.m. to fix her TV. But after realizing he did not have the right tools to fix it, he told Teresita that he would just have to come back another time, and he left her apartment shortly after 7:30 p.m. to walk back to his own apartment, which was only a block away. On that walk home, Alan did a lot of thinking. He had some serious money problems. He was currently behind on rent, and if he couldn't get his hands on a lot of cash very soon, his landlord was going to evict him and Yanka, who was several months pregnant. And when Alan wondered where and how he could come up with that kind of money, he thought of Teresita. He knew she came from a wealthy family in the Philippines, and it seemed to him that she must have a lot of cash on hand. So when Yanka went out shopping at about 8 p.m. that night, Alan decided to go back to Teresita's and rob her. When Teresita heard that knock on her front door at about 8 p.m., she was sitting at her table, busy working on her doctoral thesis. When she heard Alan's voice on the other side of the door, saying he'd come back with the right repair tools, she quickly undid the deadbolt to welcome him inside. As she turned back to close the door behind him, Alan lunged at Teresita, using his arm to encircle her neck from behind in a vicious chokehold as he dragged her into her bedroom. He continued to squeeze her neck until she was unconscious. Then, Alan lay Teresita down on the bedroom floor on her back, he stripped off all of her clothes, and arranged her body to look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he walked into the kitchen, and he grabbed a large knife that was laying on a cutting board nearby. He walked back into the bedroom with the knife in hand, and he stood over Teresita, who was still on the ground unconscious, and then he raised the knife into the air, and then drove it straight down into the center of her chest. After pausing to catch his breath and to make sure that Teresita was dead, Alan got back onto his feet and began searching the apartment for the small fortune in cash that he was sure he would find. In the end, though, after pulling out drawers, opening cupboards, and turning over small pieces of furniture, all Alan would find was just $30. Glancing at his watch, Alan knew Yanka would be back soon, and he needed to hurry. So he stepped to Teresita's bed, he pulled the mattress down on top of her to hide her body, and then he piled her clothes up on top of and next to the mattress and set it all on fire. On his way out of her bedroom, he gathered up the jewelry that he found on top of her bedroom dresser and inside her small jewelry box. Then he let himself out the front door and slipped down the hallway to the elevator and then back out to the street where he breathed in fresh, cold winter air. In his confession, Alan was convinced that Teresita never felt a thing after she lost consciousness, meaning she did not feel the knife being plunged into her chest that killed her. However, we have no way of knowing if that's actually true. 17 months after Teresita's murder, on Friday, January 27, 1979, the judge overseeing the Alan Showery murder trial declared a mistrial when the jury of 8 men and 4 women reported that they were hopelessly deadlocked and unable to reach a unanimous verdict of either guilty or not guilty. The trial itself, dubbed the Voice from the Grave trial, had been an 8-day-long national media sensation, with Alan's defense team calling into question any charge that was based on information delivered to police by Teresita's ghost. The prosecution argued that the source of the information that police got from the Chuas was immaterial. The only thing that mattered was whether the information was accurate. And even though Alan would later recant both his oral and written confessions, police said that the hard evidence they had collected proved that he was, in fact, Teresita's killer. Alan's lawyers were ecstatic when the judge declared a mistrial. They had poked so many holes in the Voice from the Dead story that they told Alan that he was sure to get a not guilty verdict in his new trial. They had also proved that Remy was an unreliable witness, that she had, in fact, known Teresita much better than she had originally told detectives, maybe even well enough to know details about what jewelry Teresita owned and the names of Teresita's relatives. But 3 weeks later, on February 22, 1979, almost 2 years to the day that Teresita was killed, Alan Showery surprised the world by changing his story yet again. This time, against the advice of his legal team, Alan changed his plea to guilty in the murder of Teresita Basa. Alan Showery was sentenced to 14 years in prison, the minimum mandatory sentence for murder. But just 4.5 years into Alan's sentence, he was released from prison on parole for good behavior. His whereabouts today are unknown. 45 years later, the case of Teresita Basa's murder remains one of the strangest investigations in police history. But whether or not you believe the story Dr. Jose Chua and his wife Remy told Chicago police, the fact remains that the information they provided to investigators turned out to be the key to finding and convicting the man who eventually confessed to being Teresita's killer. Also, as a final piece of information to think about, buried in the interview notes amongst the dozens and dozens of interviews police conducted with Edgewater Hospital employees, there are 3 different accounts from employees who all claim the same thing, that they came face to face with an apparition that looked like Teresita, who pleaded with them to help bring her killer to justice. Ballen Studios and Wondery, I'm Mr. Ballen, and this is MrBallen's Medical Mysteries. where every week we will explore a new baffling mystery originating from the one place we all can't escape, our own bodies. If you like today's story, please offer to make the Follow Buttons lunch for work, but only put durian fruit and surströmming in their lunchbox. This week's story is called Sin Nombre. On Thursday morning, April 29th, 1993, the sun rose over the high desert of Little Water, New Mexico. The air was crisp and the sky was pink as 21-year-old Florina Woody went for a run with her 19-year-old boyfriend, Merrill Bay. Florina and Merrill were both Navajo and lived in a small rural town on the vast Navajo reservation that sprawls across 3 southwestern states. Florina loved the majestic landscape surrounding the town and spent as much time as she could outdoors. And she was especially happy to be outside again after a long, wet winter. She and Merrill jogged along the country highway past small houses and trailer homes set back from the road. In the distance, Florina admired the tall red rock cliffs glowing in the sun. The couple turned off the road and headed up a path toward a flat-topped hill called a mesa. Usually, the top was dry and dusty, but the wet winter had turned it lush and green and scattered with wildflowers. Once they reached the top, they stopped to look down at the town below. Florina could just make out the trailer home that she and Merrill shared with her parents. It sometimes felt crowded living there together, but she was grateful for their close-knit family, especially since she and Merrill were raising their first child now, a 6-month-old son. Florina and Merrill jogged back down the mesa and kept a steady pace the whole way home. Merrill had recently started competing in local races and was always trying to strengthen his endurance. As for Florina, she had reasons to challenge herself too. She'd originally taken up running to offset her asthma, which had gotten better lately. Once they got home, Florina went inside their trailer, she showered, and then she went to relax on the couch. But when she sat down, she noticed her neck and back muscles were aching more than usual. She asked Merrill for a massage, but her muscles still felt sore afterwards. Florina wondered if she might have pulled something during their run, so she tried to take it easy for the rest of the day. Over the weekend and into the following week, Florina's aches and pains did not get better. She developed a cough, too, that felt different than her usual asthma. By Friday, just over a week after she first felt sick, Florina realized her symptoms were not going away with rest, so Merrill made her a doctor's appointment for the next day. On Saturday, May 8th, while Merrill watched the baby, Florina's parents drove her to Crown Point Healthcare Facility, which was located about an hour and a half south and east of their town. It was a commute Florina knew well, since she'd given birth there. Crown Point was a small rural hospital operated by the Indian Health Service with about 10 doctors. 2 of the doctors were a married couple named Christine Golnick and Thomas Hennessy, who had helped deliver Florina's baby. Florina's parents parked close to the entrance and walked with her into the lobby. Right away, Florina saw Dr. Golnick's familiar face smiling at her. Florina smiled back and waved. After signing in, she followed Dr. Golnick to an exam room in the back. Dr. Golnick placed a stethoscope on Florina's chest and listened. Then she held her fingers to Florina's wrist and measured her pulse. Florina watched Dr. Golnick's face for a reaction, but her expression remained neutral. The doctor understood why Florina was worried, since her symptoms had persisted for so long, but thankfully her vitals had come back normal, and so the doctor suspected it was just a bad case of the flu. But considering Florina's history with asthma and her lingering symptoms, Dr. Golnick didn't want to take any chances. She suggested that Florina spend the night at the hospital. In the morning, Dr. Golnick's husband, Dr. Hennessy, could come give a second opinion. Florina resisted at first, since the next day was Mother's Day. She said she wanted to get home and spend it with Merrill and their baby, but Dr. Golnick promised Florina that she could leave once Dr. Hennessy checked up on her the next day. So Florina agreed to stay. She knew that it was better to play it safe, especially because she lived so far from the hospital. She told her parents they could head home for the night, and then she called Merrill. He told her he loved her and promised he'd come get her first thing in the morning once she was discharged. The next morning, Florina woke to a knock at the door. It was Dr. Hennessy, and Florina was glad to see him, because now she was feeling worse and she was struggling to catch her breath. Dr. Hennessy listened to her lungs with a stethoscope and frowned. He told Florina that he wanted to take a chest x-ray to get a better look at her lungs. Unfortunately, that meant Florina would have to stay at the hospital a bit longer. Florina was disappointed, but she was also relieved that Dr. Hennessy seemed to be treating her symptoms so seriously. Whatever was going on with her felt much worse than the usual breathing issues she experienced from her asthma, and she was starting to get scared. A few minutes later, a technician wheeled in a mobile x-ray unit and scanned Florina's upper body. While she waited for the results, a nurse brought Florina a phone so she could call Merrill. And when Merrill answered, he told Florina that their baby was napping and they'd just celebrate Mother's Day when she got home that night. Hearing Merrill's voice calmed her down, but Florina still felt helpless and lonely. This was not how she envisioned her first Mother's Day going. A little over an hour later, the X-ray technician brought Florina's test results to Dr. Hennessy. The image showed Florina's lungs all whited out, which meant they were full of fluid. Dr. Hennessy was shocked by what he saw, and he ran to Florina's room. He found her lying there with her eyes half closed and her mouth ringed with a dry white liquid. She was desperately struggling to breathe. Dr. Hennessy couldn't believe it. For a patient this young and athletic to go from healthy to near respiratory failure in 24 hours was unheard of. The doctor immediately called for a helicopter to fly Florina to the University of New Mexico Hospital in Albuquerque, which had a much better equipped intensive care unit. But until the helicopter arrived, Dr. Hennessy had to try everything possible to stabilize her condition. He fitted Florina with an oxygen mask to pump air into her lungs, but within a few moments, she coughed up bloody pink froth. Dr. Hennessy's face turned ashen as he realized what was happening. Florina's lungs were so congested, the extra oxygen was not doing anything. And there was another urgent problem. Florina's blood pressure was dropping rapidly. Dr. Hennessy shouted for a nurse to give Florina IV fluids, and as the medicine entered Florina's body, Dr. Hennessy's eyes shot over to the monitors tracking her vitals. They were still extremely weak. Florina's body just wasn't getting enough oxygen, and her organs were starting to shut down. Getting Florina to breathe was now a matter of life and death. The doctor quickly snapped on a pair of fresh gloves, he grabbed a scalpel from an operating tray, and then took a deep breath to steady himself. And then, when Dr. Hennessy was ready, he carefully cut an incision into Florina's throat and inserted a breathing tube directly into Florina's airway. He heard Florina's heart rate monitor beep rapidly for a few moments, and then it went flat. Florina had gone into cardiac arrest. Dr. Hennessy knew he only had a few seconds left to save her life. He started CPR while the nurse grabbed the defibrillator. Once it was charged, the doctor grabbed the paddles and pressed them to Florina's chest, and then the machine released a bolt of electricity into her body. Florina's heart rate monitor stayed flat, so Dr. Hennessy recharged the defibrillator and sent another shock through Florina's body. Just then, a nurse ran in and told the doctor that the helicopter had just arrived. But, by this point, Dr. Hennessy just shook his head. It was too late. Florina was dead. Later that morning, Florina's fiancé, Merrill, was at home sitting by the baby's crib when his phone rang. He recognized the voice on the other end as one of the doctors from Crown Point Hospital, but the words he was hearing, he just couldn't compute. Something had gone terribly wrong, Florina had died, and no one really knew why. Doctors were running tests, but they had never seen anything like it before. Merrill crumpled to the floor. When he'd kissed Florina goodbye less than 24 hours ago, she'd been a bit under the weather, but it didn't seem serious. He didn't understand how this could have happened. Merrill took a moment to gather himself, then he walked into the kitchen where Florina's parents were having their morning coffee. He tried to tell them what had happened, but the words got stuck in his throat. Then he just closed his eyes, let out a deep breath, and blurted out, "Florina is dead." Florina's parents stared at him blankly. Her mother asked him what he was talking about. Tears started streaming out of Merrill's eyes as he explained what the doctors had just told him. Florina really was dead. It had happened extremely fast, and the doctors couldn't do anything to save her. This time, it sunk in, and Florina's parents started sobbing. How could a 21-year-old mother in perfect health just suddenly die? That night, Merrill barely slept. and the next day he woke up in a fog. Food tasted like nothing. He fed and changed the baby, but it felt mechanical. Everything reminded him of Florina. On Tuesday, May 11th, so 2 days after Florina died, Merrill woke up feeling weak and sluggish. He felt like it was something more than the physical effects of his grief, and he was concerned after what had happened to his wife. The doctors still didn't know what killed Florina, and Merrill didn't want to take any chances. However, he had a lot of planning to do for Florina's funeral, and he didn't want to drive all the way to the Crown Point Hospital, so he decided to go to the local health clinic instead. Merrill told the doctor there what had happened to Florina and that he was now feeling sick. The doctor agreed that Merrill was right to be cautious, but he said Merrill's situation was different than his wife's. Florina had asthma, and that likely contributed to her very rapid decline. The doctor told Merrill to rest and sent him home with a prescription-strength pain reliever, an antibiotic, and an antiviral medication. Merrill took these medications over the next few days, but none of them seemed to work. He felt more exhausted each day, and even worse on Friday, May 14th, which was the day of Florina's funeral. Florina's cousin picked Merrill up at the family's trailer that morning, and then they set off for the 70-mile drive south to Sunset Memorial Park in Gallup, New Mexico, where Florina was going to be buried. But they hadn't been in the car long before Merrill started gasping for air. Now, this was before people carried cell phones, so Merrill's cousin had to pull off the highway at a general store to call 911 on a landline. And while he did that, Merrill stumbled out of the car and lurched around in the parking lot, panicking, while his lips and fingernails started turning blue, and then he just collapsed. Paramedics got to the location quickly and raced Merrill to the Gallup Indian Medical Center, and once they arrived, nurses wheeled his stretcher into the emergency room. But by the time he was inside, Merrill had stopped breathing. The physician on duty, Dr. Bruce Tempest, tried to revive him, but it was no use. He declared Merrill dead upon arrival. Later that day, Dr. Tempest sat slumped in a chair, feeling defeated. He had worked at Gallup Indian Medical Center for 23 years and was widely considered an expert at internal medicine. He'd even been awarded the Indian Health Service Clinician of the Year in 1983. But he had felt powerless, being unable to save Merrill's life. As Dr. Tempest signed and dated Merrill's time of death paperwork, an assistant mentioned that the man's fiancée had died too just a week earlier, and like Merrill, she had been in good shape and just declined really quickly. Dr. Tempest felt a wave of fear rise in his chest. Two young, physically fit people didn't just suddenly die of respiratory failure, one right after another. Something had to make them sick. As he thought about Merrill's death, Dr. Tempest realized he'd seen other cases like it. In the past 6 months, he had treated 3 other young Navajos with fatal respiratory issues. He couldn't help wondering if maybe these deaths were all connected. Whatever had killed Florina and Merrill might have killed the others too. The fact that all of the dead were Navajos living within the same general area led the doctor to suspect that this disease might be contagious, and if he had to guess, it seemed like it spread through the air, since the lungs were the most affected organ in every case. If he was right, this could be the start of an incredibly dangerous outbreak. But before he jumped to any conclusions, he needed to gather more information. Dr. Tempest called Crown Point Medical Center, where Florina had been treated before she died. He explained he had treated her boyfriend and wanted to learn what happened to Florina. The doctors at Crown Point didn't hesitate to share a detailed breakdown of her illness. Afterwards, Dr. Tempest hung up and compared both cases. Florina's sounded exactly like what happened to Merrill. It just didn't make sense to Dr. Tempest. He'd never heard of any disease that behaved like this. Also, during this call, the doctor had learned something else that totally puzzled him. Merrill and Florina's 6-month-old son had not gotten sick at all. If this was a contagious airborne disease, the baby would have probably caught it from one of his parents. And why hadn't the grandparents gotten sick either? There was one more thing that was bothering Dr. Tempest. So far, there hadn't been any mild cases of this disease reported. Every single person who got sick died. This disease was unlike anything he had seen before, If it kept spreading, many more people could die. That weekend, Dr. Tempest compiled all the information he could on Florina and Merrill's cases. Then, 3 days after he pronounced Merrill dead, Dr. Tempest phoned the state health department and told them they had a problem. "11 days later, Dr. Jeffrey Dutchin was wrapping up his work at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, where he investigated dangerous outbreaks of disease. He was still in training at the CDC, and the work was demanding. Now he was looking forward to spending the long Memorial Day weekend with his family. But as he was getting ready to leave, there was a knock on his door. It was Dr. Dutchin's boss, and he had a critical job for him. Something troubling was happening on the Navajo reservation. Young, healthy people were dying, and no one knew why. 6 people had already died from this mystery illness, and 4 others had been hospitalized. The CDC was sending out a team early tomorrow morning, and his boss wanted Dr. Dutchin to be a part of it. Dr. Dutchin immediately switched gears and started putting documents in his briefcase. It didn't matter that he had plans with his family. This was urgent. That night, Dr. Dutchin met with the team that was being sent to the Navajo reservation to go over their plan. Once the meeting ended, he was handed a doctor's bag and opened it up to look at the equipment. Along with the regular tools of his trade, he was surprised to find something completely unexpected: a gas mask. Dr. Dutchin knew that it was too early to know what they were up against, but the signs were not good. The next day, Dr. Dutchin and 2 other colleagues from the CDC landed in New Mexico and went straight to an emergency conference of over 30 public health officials. Huge whiteboards lined every wall of the conference room, scribbled with the names of possible germs and toxins, everything from herpes to heavy metals to pesticides and plagues. The mood was frantic. Dr. Dutchin was overwhelmed by all the theories and potential diseases being proposed. Each theory was discussed and dissected. The more possibilities they ruled out, the more worried Dutchin felt. It meant that the cause of death was either something so rare there were very few experts on it, or it was something entirely new. And the longer researchers took to find answers, the more people could die. In fact, on the same day the conference started, a seemingly healthy teenage Navajo girl had collapsed at a school dance at a state park. She died a few hours later. Her death was a stark reminder that the clock was ticking. There was only so much the gathered scientists could accomplish by looking at whiteboards in a conference room. They needed more data. Dr. Dutchin and his colleagues decided to survey some local residents and gather blood samples from anyone who was willing to participate. 2 days after the CDC team arrived, the president of the Navajo Nation, Peterson Za, looked out the window of his office in Window Rock, Arizona. The whole Four Corners area, where Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado meet, and where the Navajo live, had turned into a media circus. News vans were crammed into every available space of the parking lot below. Za's phone was ringing nonstop with calls from journalists, health officials, and locals asking for information on this mystery disease. Za had nothing to tell any of them, but he hoped that would change soon. The Navajo leader was not participating in the CDC's big conference, although he was keeping tabs on their progress. He'd barely slept over the weekend because he was anxiously waiting for any updates. But from what he'd seen so far, he thought the CDC's investigation and the media attention it brought had not been much help. Za's people were terrified, and the outsiders' ignorance of Navajo customs was adding to their panic. Newspapers were printing the names of the deceased right away, even though Navajo tradition forbade their names from being spoken or written for 4 days after they died. This was causing a lot of pain and confusion for the Navajo people. They believed this would prevent the spirit of the dead from properly transitioning to the afterlife. And aggravating the already sensitive situation, some scientists were going right up to people's homes and knocking on the door. They had no idea that Navajo custom required them to wait 30 feet away until they were invited inside. These cultural misunderstandings had led to escalating tension on the reservation, and Za was worried about what might happen next. Just then, the phone rang again. It was a Navajo woman from the reservation claiming that some medical researchers were bothering her family. Za assured her he would be right there to handle the situation. Za hung up, then headed outside. He made his way through the crowd of reporters waiting outside his office. As they shouted questions at him, he promised he'd share any new information with them as soon as he had it. Then he got in his truck and headed to the address the woman on the phone had given him. A few minutes later, Za pulled up to a cluster of low Pueblo buildings that marked the address. The sun was high, barely casting shadows across the dusty ground. Za saw a small crowd shouting at two men who were standing off to the side. Both the men looked rattled and confused. Za assumed they were the scientists that the woman had called him about. The situation looked heated, and he sensed it was about to get out of control. Za got out of his truck and recognized the woman who'd called him, and when she saw him, she ran over to him and explained what was going on. The two scientists had knocked on her door, asking if her family would be willing to donate blood for testing. Za shook his head in disgust. Now he understood why the crowd was so upset. He wove his way through them and walked up to the two scientists. Everyone grew silent as Za introduced himself and explained that the researchers had deeply violated Navajo custom. The scientists' unannounced arrival at the woman's house was considered trespassing by the Navajo people, but even more offensive was their request for a blood sample. The Navajo believe that blood is spiritually attached to the body, and giving a blood sample is seen as a grave violation of privacy. The scientists' ignorance of this cultural belief was an insult to this woman. The scientists' faces turned red, and they apologized profusely. They said they were there on official business researching the outbreak and did not mean to offend anyone. Za cautioned them to be more careful. He wanted to stop this outbreak as much as they did, but if the scientists could not get people to trust them, then they certainly would never learn what caused this disease. The scientists apologized again and packed up to leave. Za calmed the crowd and told the woman to call if any other strange people came around. He had a feeling that there was more trouble to come. Back at his office that same day, Za read the latest news on the outbreak with growing discouragement. The Navajo people weren't just facing problems on the reservation. People in the wider area were beginning to shun them out of fear of the disease. There were several articles about Navajo families being banned from local restaurants and businesses. There was even a report about 27 Navajo third graders from Chinle, Arizona, being denied a field trip to visit pen pals at another school in California. And worse, people were still dying. The death toll was now up to 10, and many more were very sick. Za's eyes locked on one particular article about the outbreak in the Washington Post. A particular phrase in the opening paragraph immediately jumped out at him. It said, quote, "The Navajo flu." He slammed the newspaper down on his desk and rubbed his temples. This had gone far enough. He called in his assistant and told her to schedule a leadership council meeting immediately. The next day, Dr. Ben Muneta, an Indian Health Services doctor in New Mexico, received a call from Za's assistant inviting him to a meeting that night in Window Rock, Arizona, about the outbreak. Dr. Muneta understood why he was being asked to go. His grandfather had been a famous medicine man in the tribe. He had inspired Dr. Muneta to become a Stanford-trained physician with a unique knowledge of both modern science and traditional Navajo medicine. Dr. Muneta had been at the CDC's conference and could be a bridge between their investigation and the Navajo people. He told the assistant he'd be there. As he drove to Window Rock, Dr. Muneta passed a sign nailed to a telephone pole that said, quote, "No media allowed, no newspaper, TV, radio, etc. This means you," end quote. He could tell the locals were clearly fed up with the negative attention. His thoughts turned to his colleague at the CDC, Jeffrey Dutchin. Dr. Dutchin and the other scientists were doing their best to solve this mystery, but they needed help from the Navajo. He hoped that this meeting he was going to have with President Za was the start of that. A few minutes later, Dr. Muneta arrived at Za's office and was led to a small conference room. Dr. Muneta realized this wouldn't be anything like the CDC's giant conference. It was an intentionally small meeting that left out the federal researchers altogether. Za didn't want them interfering in Navajo business. Aside from Za, there were a few senior Navajo medicine men in attendance. The only other physician in the room was the state's deputy commissioner of health. Once everyone was seated, President Za asked Dr. Mineta to update them on how the investigation was going so far. Dr. Mineta admitted that the CDC hadn't found much yet, but they were testing freely given blood samples for all kinds of diseases and working through all the possibilities. Dr. Mineta then turned to the medicine men and asked them for their prayers. The eldest medicine man was grateful for Dr. Mineta's request, but instead of prayers, he offered his own interpretation of the mystery disease outbreak. He believed that too many young Navajo were abandoning traditional practices such as speaking the language and living off the land. They were neglecting ceremonies that were meant to heal the sick, bring good fortune, and celebrate life's milestones. One of the most important of these is called the Blessing Way, which is performed for newborns, brides and grooms, and people who are sick or who have experienced a traumatic event. Without these traditions to keep the world in balance, death was sure to follow. Dr. Mineta could sense the medicine man was holding something back. However, it would be improper for him to press his elder for more information. According to Navajo custom, if Dr. Mineta wanted more knowledge, he had to partake in a ceremony that lasted for several days. As much as Dr. Mineta wanted to adhere to tradition, he knew there was no time to waste. He gathered himself, then sat up straight and looked at the eldest medicine man. In a quiet but very firm voice, Dr. Mineta asked if the medicine man could just tell him more. For a long moment, the medicine man just stared at him. Dr. Mineta felt a knot growing in the pit of his stomach. He knew how upset the Navajos already were that the investigators were violating their customs, and now Dr. Mineta, who knew better, had done it as well. Finally, the medicine man spoke. He acknowledged that Dr. Mineta's behavior was irregular, but considering the gravity of the situation, he agreed to say more, and immediately Dr. Mineta let out a sigh of relief. According to the elder, this was not the first time a deadly illness like this had struck the Navajo. There had been 2 other bouts of mysterious respiratory failure deaths in their community. One was in 1918, and the other was in 1933. It was a long time ago, but stories were still told among the Navajo about those who had died. Dr. Mineta asked if there had been anything similar about the years in question. The medicine man nodded. Both had been unseasonably wet winters with lots of rain, just like this recent one. Then he described how water changed the land, and these changes in turn brought a creature that carried death. Dr. Mineta knew what the medicine man was referring to. The creature was a real animal that was a prominent figure in Navajo mythology. Navajo called it Na'atsunse and believed it was equally capable of spreading life or death. In Navajo legend, if Na'atsunse entered a home and saw people being wasteful, it would then choose the Navajo's strongest young people to die. Mineta thought about what the medicine man revealed. The doctor didn't think that this animal was literally passing judgment on the Navajo and killing them, and in real life, he'd never heard of it spreading a disease like this through contact with humans. But as he considered the possibility, he came up with a theory that explained how it could happen. And if he was right, it would completely explain this deadly outbreak. Dr. Mineta raced back home and called his CDC colleague, Jeffrey Dutchin, who had led the emergency conference the week before. Dutchin was relieved to hear that the disease was not completely new, but he was confused when Dr. Mineta explained that the outbreak was related to the rain. This land had experienced every type of weather over time. Rain was not unusual, but this disease was. Dr. Mineta told him that it wasn't the rain itself. It was the animal from Navajo legends that came as a result of the rain. And if they were going to solve this mystery, then they would need to find as many of these creatures as possible. Dr. Mineta could sense Dr. Dutchin hesitate, but so far nothing else had worked, and as strange as this theory was about mythical creatures, it was the most promising lead they had. And so Dr. Dutchin told Dr. Mineta he'd get a team together right away. And this time, he'd make sure the investigators respected the Navajo's cultural practices. 3 days later, Dr. Dutchin walked out of his hotel a few miles south of the Navajo reservation. He'd organized this investigation with the help of President Za, and it would be conducted with the help and guidance of medicine men and other Navajo representatives. Dr. Dutchin scanned the parking lot and spotted 4 men gathered around a couple of beat-up trucks. Dr. Dutchin smiled and headed over to them. They were the CDC experts sent to trap the animals that Dr. Mineta had told him about. Another car pulled up next to them, and a stocky Navajo man climbed out. He was an environmental health expert sent by President Za to help with the investigation. He clapped Dr. Dutchin on the back and promised he'd help them find what they were looking for. Dr. Dutchin felt a surge of hope. Thanks to the Navajos, he believed they knew what was making people sick. Now they'd be able to track down that creature that was spreading disease around the area, and hopefully they could figure out how to treat the illness before it killed anyone else. They all piled into a truck and headed for the Navajo reservation. The next day, Dr. Dutchin stood in the middle of the desert. He was dressed in full biohazard gear, a silver suit, airtight helmet, and heavy boots and gloves. He looked across the desert landscape at the other members of his team. They were all dressed in the same protective gear. To outside observers, they might have all looked like astronauts from a movie set. But the work they were doing was very real, and if they weren't careful, it could be very dangerous. Dr. Dutchin was standing above a trap he'd set the day before. Before he checked it, he made sure the wind was blowing away from him to avoid inhaling any harmful particles. If he caught an infected animal, he could be at serious risk for picking up this disease. Once Dr. Dutchin was certain that he was safe, he cautiously bent down and examined the trap. Through the thick material of his helmet, he could hear a faint sound coming from inside, the sounds of a trapped animal. He looked over to his colleagues, who were also examining their traps. Dr. Dutchin hoped that at least one of them had caught what they were looking for. Over the next few days, Dr. Dutchin and his team caught all sorts of animals. They carefully took samples and sent them off to the CDC in Atlanta for analysis. On June 16th, 4 days after the specimens arrived in Atlanta, Dr. Dutchin got his confirmation. The disease afflicting the Navajo wasn't entirely new. It was called a hantavirus. But this strain of hantavirus was entirely unique. The CDC had not been able to identify it earlier because it typically attacks the kidneys, while this particular strain affected people's lungs. But thanks to the tip from the Navajo's medicine men, the CDC scientists knew what was spreading the disease. It was the creature known as the Naatsunse. When Dr. Mineta met with President Za and the medicine men, they told him how this real-life animal played a prominent role in the Navajo's origin myth. According to Navajo legend, the creature is responsible for spreading the seeds of life across the world. However, it can also be dangerous, and its breath can be fatal. This animal is incredibly common in North America, but the Navajo fear it so intensely they burn their clothes if it even touches them. Individually, this animal is not a huge threat, because each one doesn't carry enough of the hantavirus to endanger anyone. But if there's enough of them, they can spread disease like wildfire. In that winter, the heavy rains in the Four Corners area created a concentrated population of the animal that had only occurred twice before, in 1918 and in 1933. In all three instances, the heavy rains had led to more plants and vegetation. This in turn fed the creature and allowed them to multiply. The creature then infiltrated the homes of Navajo people like Florina Woody and Merrill Bay, leaving traces of the hantavirus everywhere they went. The creature that was responsible for spreading this disease was the humble deer mouse. And a hantavirus is a family of viruses spread mainly by rodents. And that spring, deer mice had been all over the Navajo reservation and surrounding area. They crept into homes, they nested in sheds, barns, and storage units. No matter how many holes were plugged or traps were laid, there were just too many of them to stop. And wherever they went, they left their droppings, which carried the deadly virus. When people like Florina and Merrill tried to clean those areas, they came into direct contact with the droppings, and the virus entered their bodies in high enough concentrations to infect them. But now that the CDC knew what was behind the outbreak, local officials could reduce the danger. After the deer mouse was identified as the culprit, public health advisories urged people to avoid rodents and told them how to make it harder for them to enter their homes. And while that didn't eliminate the danger entirely, it reduced it enough to help the outbreak end by the middle of August, almost 3 months after Florina Woody died. All told, 24 people in the Four Corners area were infected with this previously unknown virus. Tragically, half of them died. But thanks to the cooperation between the CDC and the Navajo people, the damage was limited, and there have been very few outbreaks since then. In keeping with the Navajo custom of not speaking the names of the dead, the CDC decided to call this North American hantavirus strain sin nombre, which means without a name. In the 1970s, a young woman and young man were on their very first date together, and it wasn't going very well. It wasn't going badly, it was just really, really awkward. They just were not meshing at all. And so as they're getting ready to leave and retire for the night, the guy is thinking to himself, I have nothing to lose here, we're probably not going to go on a second date. And he says to the woman, hey, do you want to not go home right now and actually come on a hike with me? And he goes, I know this sounds like a terrible idea, but hear me out. I go mountain climbing in this area called Provo Canyon. It's not that far from here. There are these beautiful trails that lead up the side of the canyon to these amazing scenic overlooks. And tonight it's a new moon, so there's great visibility. And I just think that you might enjoy it. And so at first, the woman is obviously a little bit hesitant. But when he says, look, I go hiking there at night all the time. I love it out there. And I promise if there's any weirdness, if you don't like being there, we'll just turn around and leave. It's totally safe. And so after a little bit of coaxing, she finally says, okay, you know what? That sounds fun. Let's go do it. And so their date that had been really awkward suddenly became really exciting. And the two of them were kind of like thrilled, like, wow, look at us making our way up for a nighttime hike through Provo Canyon. And so they arrive at the mouth of this canyon, and they're both obviously excited, and they hop out and they start walking up this trail that brings them into a heavily forested section of the canyon. Now, to this point, the guy felt like this was a really great idea. He really had gone hiking here a bunch, and he really did know the area well. But as the trail brought them into the forested area, the guy remembers feeling this overwhelming sense of dread. He didn't know why, it was just like an overwhelming sense of anxiety that something bad was going to happen to them. But he had worked so hard to convince his date to come with him, and had convinced her it was safe, that he's not about to let on to her that there was anything wrong with what they were doing. And so he put on, his strong face and just kind of suppressed it and just kept on walking and, holding her hand tight, and they just continued their walk. But his sense of dread would just build and build to the point where he was really on edge. And what he didn't know, but would find out later, is that his date, the woman, she also had this horrible sense of dread as soon as they went into the forest. But she didn't want to tell him because she didn't want to seem like a party pooper, because he seemed really excited about it. At some point as they're walking down this path, the man steps on something that felt soft. He didn't know what it was, but it caused him to freeze immediately, and he's holding her hand. He kind of jerks her to get her to stop, and before he can even look down and see what he's standing on, he hears rustling coming from the bushes just off the trail. She hears it too, and both of them, without saying a word to each other, because again, you gotta remember, they're both really stressed. They haven't let on to the other how stressed they are, but they're both basically ready to leave. And so the two of them turn around and they hightail it out of there. He has no idea what he stepped on. They don't know what they heard in the bushes, but they don't care. The anxiety was so high, they just wanted to leave. Years later, that man and woman who had this very strange date would actually be married. And they'd be sitting down watching TV together, and they're flipping through the channels, and they land on an interview with a death row inmate. And the interviewer is asking the inmate, was there ever a time that you were almost caught red-handed? And the guy being interviewed says, yes, one time. I was in the forest up in Provo Canyon one night, and a young couple came walking up the trail. I didn't see them, so I only had a chance to jump into the bushes right next to the trail, and the guy actually stepped on the body of a girl I had just killed. But for some reason, he didn't look down and see what he was standing on, and the two of them didn't notice me just a few feet away from them. They just turned around and walked away. Turns out that young couple had run into one of the worst serial killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Before Bundy was executed, he confessed to over 30 murders, but many people believe the true number of victims is much, much, much higher. Our next story is called Parents Know Best. After spending 21 years in the U.S. Army, a man retires and moves to Central Florida with his wife and young son. Although his family had plenty of money because he had a pension coming in and his wife still worked full-time, he just got bored really quickly after moving to Central Florida and decided he would just take a job doing something just to stay occupied. And so he ended up taking a job at a highway gas station. One of the primary reasons he chose this particular job is because the owners of the gas station didn't care if his son came along to help him stock shelves and hang out behind the cash register. And so for years, that's just how it went. The man would work at the gas station and his son would tag along. Even after his son became a teenager and you'd think might be wanting to do other things, well, the town was so small, there was almost nothing to do. So his son still came along well into his teenage years. One night in 1990, his son, who was 15 years old at the time, was at the station and he was actually taking a break sitting outside on a picnic table. He was reading a magazine, drinking a Mountain Dew, and it's dark out, and he notices out of the corner of his eye that there is a woman walking off of the highway towards the gas station. It was a very quiet night at the time, so there's no cars getting gas, there's nobody there, and there's not really anybody even driving on the highway, and so that's why she really stood out to him. And he turns and he notices her, and he thinks to himself, no one ever walks to our gas station. We're on a highway. Everybody drives here. So she must have broken down and she must be coming here to try to use our phone to call a tow truck or something like that. So the woman is walking across the lot, coming closer and closer to the gas station, and the boy at this point has turned his attention back to his magazine, but he would say later that he kept looking up and keeping an eye on her because there was something off about her. The woman ultimately walks right behind him and goes in the door into the gas station. Doesn't acknowledge the boy, doesn't say hi to him, just walks straight inside, and she starts walking up and down the aisles of the gas station. Now, from where the boy was sitting, it's all glass, so he could clearly look in and see his father behind the counter, and he could see the head of this woman as she walked in and around all these aisles. And as soon as the woman was in the store, kind of pacing around the aisles, the boy put his magazine down and was just watching. And he noticed that she was not really shopping. She was just looking down for a few seconds, wouldn't pick anything up, so she wasn't buying anything. And she would look up at the counter where his father was, and she would just stare at him, and then she'd look back down at what she was doing, and she would go through all the aisles. And at some point, the woman just kind of abandons this phony, I'm pretending to shop routine, and just walks up to the counter. Now, nobody else is in the store, there's nobody else coming in, and so the boy could actually fairly clearly hear what she was saying to his father. And she told his father that she had broken down and she needed a ride and could he drive her to Ocala, which was the next big town north of this gas station. And the boy would say that his father acted very strangely because his father is normally incredibly pleasant with all the customers. He's very chatty even. Like he talks to everybody who comes in the store. But as soon as this woman had gone in, his dad had seemed kind of dismissive and almost rude to this woman. And when she was talking to him, asking for a ride, he just said, no, I won't give you a ride. The woman is annoyed by how quickly she's been shot down, but instead of just taking no for an answer, she turns and looks at the boy who's sitting out on the bench, who's looking right at her, and she points at the boy and she says, what about him? Is he your son? Can he give me a ride? The boy notices that his father, who's not within her eyesight, is looking at his son going, no. Like, whatever she wants from you, you're gonna say no to it. And the boy's a little bit confused by this because he's still trying to understand why his dad was so against helping this woman because she clearly needs our help or someone's help. But he just took his dad at face value. And when the woman's pointing at him, he knew, the boy, that if she came over and asked him, he would say no. But it wouldn't come to that because the boy's father would say to the woman, no, my son's not going to give you a ride. You need to leave here immediately. Do not come back. Leave. We're not going to help you. She's furious, she's cussing him out, she storms out and slams the door, she starts cussing at the boy, and she walks off. The whole time she's turning around and flipping them off and screaming profanities at them, but she ultimately walks off, and the dad kind of followed her out and is standing next to his son as she walks off. And the boy asks his dad, like, what was her deal? Why did that happen? Why did you not want to help her? And the dad just said, I don't know, there was something off about her, and I don't know how to place it, but I did not want her around you. I knew I didn't want to give her a ride. I knew she had to go. A year later, the boy is in his room when he hears his dad in the other room yelling for him to come in here and look at the TV. So he runs into the TV room, and on the TV is the same woman from the gas station. Better known as Eileen Wuornos, she was a serial killer who used to pick up her male victims at gas stations in Florida. It's unclear whether the boy or the boy's father were her next victims, but by the time she had shown up at that gas station, she had already killed 4 people. And following that interaction with them at the gas station, she had gone on to kill 3 more people, including someone in Ocala, Florida, which was the town she had asked them to give her a ride to. Eileen had been caught, that's why she was on TV, and she was later sentenced to death. The next and final story of today's episode is called That'll Do, Pig. By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends, she had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in, there was no barn for her animals or tools, there was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So, when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car pop 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman. And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her, They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan, because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm. And initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much, and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack, he handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look after your dog." And then Robert nodded as thank you, he turned around, and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him, and then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman, that was how he made his living, and so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car, and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad, because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially murdered someone and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously this was very suspicious, and right away the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance. And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately. And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, okay, and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you. And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, no, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after. And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card, but Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card and that was it. And so after several minutes, the sheriff realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, ma'am, you're going to have to come with us. Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, has anyone died on your property? The story that Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away, after that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on, and so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realized they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs and she begins pulling them aside, and then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back and his insides had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyways. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn, because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask. And so he just said, well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe we could have saved him. Or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone? Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream because she sold her pigs' meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn. And so finally, the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm, and if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble because we're going to find it. At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting, and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back, and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators. And she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. And the investigators are like, who's Stephen? We're talking about Robert. What are you talking about? Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delicino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard, but at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a gun went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched as Susan's stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. We can only hope they were dead before her pigs began eating them. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen, and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a cup of coffee, but be sure it's full of coffee grounds. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the Mr. Ballin Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the Mr. Ballin Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today.